My name is Jenny, and for decades I lived the kind of life most people only see in movies. Private jets, board meetings, summer homes and places where the sand was actually white. You name it, I owned it, or at least a significant share of it. When my husband Richard passed away 3 years ago, he left me with an estate so vast, it took a team of lawyers 6 months just to finalize the paperwork. A fortune. The kind of money that guarantees comfort for generations. But here's the thing about that kind of money. It's a magnet, and not just for good things. It distorts relationships, it changes people, and most terrifyingly, it changes how your own children see you. I realized I wasn't just mom anymore. I was the estate, the principal, the will. And that feeling, let me tell you, is colder than any winter in Aspen. It felt like my life was a giant gilded prison and the bars were made of dollar signs. I had 3 sons, 3 men I raised, loved, and poured my soul into, and I had this gnawing, terrible suspicion that only one of them still saw the real me. The suspicion was so loud in my head, it drowned out the sound of the ocean at my beach house. I needed to know the truth before I made the biggest decision of my life. Deciding who would inherit everything. Because trust me, when you have this much, you don't just hand it out based on birth order. You hand it out based on merit, not financial merit, but human merit. My 3 boys, bless their hearts, were successful, at least on paper. There was David, my eldest. David was the investment banker, slicked back hair, custom suits, always talking about quarterly reports and market adjustments. He lived in a penthouse in Manhattan that looked like it was stolen from a design magazine. Every conversation with him felt like a pitch meeting. "Mom, you really should optimize your portfolio," he'd say, frowning at my preference for old-fashioned tangible assets. He saw my money as a machine that wasn't running efficiently enough. Then there was Mark, the middle child. Mark was the high-tech entrepreneur. He had a few minor successes, a couple of flashy failures, but his current startup, something involving AI and dog grooming, I think, had just secured a massive Series B funding round. He was the most ostentatious of the 3. He drove a ludicrously expensive sports car, always had some exotic supermodel on his arm, and measured his self-worth entirely by the number of zeros in his net worth. When Mark called, it was usually to ask if I'd considered investing in his newest can't-fail venture. They were both brilliant, ambitious, and financially thriving. But then there was Ben, my youngest. Ben was the artist. Ben was the one who refused to join the corporate rat race, chasing instead the fickle, beautiful dream of being a sculptor. He taught classes part-time and rented a tiny, run-down apartment in the city's older, less glamorous section. His studio was in the basement, constantly smelling faintly of damp earth and turpentine. Ben was perpetually struggling. He wasn't poor, not really, but he was always worried about the next rent payment, always driving a beaten-up pickup truck that seemed held together by hope and duct tape. He never asked me for money, not once, even though I knew he often skipped meals just to buy a specific type of clay. When he called, it was to talk about his latest piece, or maybe to tell me about a stray cat he'd taken in. With David and Mark, the conversation eventually led to money. With Ben, it never did. And that, more than anything, fueled my need for this crazy, terrifying test. I remember the day I decided. I was sitting in my enormous, silent living room, looking out over the manicured lawn. David had just called, suggesting I sell the estate and move into a smaller, more manageable condo. Red, easier to liquidate. Mark had emailed, showing me photos of a yacht he was considering buying and casually mentioning that I could easily finance it. It was exhausting. I slammed the phone down and looked at my reflection in the window. I saw a perfectly groomed, well-preserved woman in expensive silk. I saw the fortune's shield. And I thought, what if I strip all this away? What if I become nothing? What if I became invisible, powerless, and utterly unremarkable? Would they still see Jenny, their mother? Or would they just see a nuisance, an obstacle to their perfectly curated lives? The plan started small, a flicker of madness. I spent the next few days researching. I watched documentaries about the homeless population in our city, learning about their routines, their unspoken rules, the harsh realities they faced every single day. I couldn't just throw on some dirty clothes. It had to be convincing. It had to be a complete transformation. It had to project vulnerability, need, and most importantly, absolute poverty. I wanted the kind of look that made people automatically avert their eyes. I went to a few thrift stores, not the fancy vintage ones, but the truly dilapidated ones far from my usual haunts. I bought a shapeless, stained woolen coat that smelled faintly of mothballs, several layers of threadbare clothing, and an old dirty knitted hat. I even bought a pair of mismatched worn-out gloves and some cheap clunky men's boots. The most important purchase was the makeup. Not the glamorous kind, but the kind that adds age, grime, and exhaustion. I practiced in front of a mirror in my guest bathroom, transforming my own face until I barely recognized the haunted, drawn-out stranger staring back. It was unsettling. Just out of curiosity, if you're watching this right now, drop a comment below and tell me what time it is where you are and what city you're watching from. It helps me understand where this story is reaching. The day I put the full costume on, it was like stepping into another skin, a much colder, heavier skin. I smudged charcoal dust on my face, ran a brush through my hair until it looked matted and neglected, and even learned how to make my voice sound rougher and used. My heart pounded. This wasn't just a prank. This was a defining moment. I was risking my self-respect, my comfort, and maybe even the last shreds of my hope for my family. But the stakes were too high to back down. The fortune wasn't just money. It was my legacy, Richard's legacy, and it deserved to go to a person with a good heart. A fortune can't buy kindness, but it can certainly test its limits. And I was about to find out exactly where my son's limits lay. The spot I chose was perfect. A busy, upscale corner downtown, right near the financial district where David worked and near the high-end coffee shop where Mark liked to hold his casual, power-broking meetings. It was a place where successful people felt most secure, and where the invisible ones were truly invisible. I put the few possessions I carried, my real ID, my cell phone, and a small key to the back door of my mansion, into a hidden pocket I'd sewn into the lining of the old coat. I took a deep breath, looked at my reflection one last time and saw not Jenny, the wealthy widow, but someone nameless, homeless, and utterly alone. The test was about to begin. The world changes completely when you look like nothing. It's not just a subtle shift. It's a seismic, terrifying reversal of reality. The moment I stepped out of the taxi, I had the driver drop me off a block away so he wouldn't see me apply the final layers of grime. It was like I became a ghost. People who were chatting animatedly suddenly went silent as I approached. Their faces, just moments before open and relaxed, snapped shut like clams. Their eyes looked through me, not at me. The air itself felt colder, heavier with judgment. Remember how I talked about the fortune being a shield? Well, without it, I was utterly exposed to the harsh elements of human indifference. I found my spot exactly where I planned, near the entrance of a high-end corporate building, nestled just off the main thoroughfare. I positioned myself near a planter box, which offered a small barrier from the pedestrian traffic but was still highly visible. I opened a stained canvas bag and pulled out a tattered piece of cardboard, writing a few shaky words on it with a blunt marker. Lost everything. Anything helps. God bless. It felt utterly humiliating and yet thrillingly necessary. This wasn't just acting. It was immersion. I leaned back against the cold concrete, pulled my hat low and waited. The stench of my own disguise, a mix of fake body odor and the mildewy old coat, was overpowering. It was a sensory attack that drove home the reality of the people I was impersonating. The first few hours were brutal, just a parade of expensive shoes and hurried whispers. I saw dozens of people I actually knew, people who had been guests at my parties, people I had served on charity boards with. They sailed past, their gazes fixed firmly on their phones or the middle distance, avoiding any kind of eye contact that might require a moment of acknowledgement. The silence was the loudest part. No one spoke to me. No one even sneered or offered a rude comment. It was pure, absolute non-existence. I tried to remember the feeling of sitting in a climate-controlled boardroom sipping artisanal coffee, and it felt like a memory from a different lifetime, a fictional character I used to play. Now let's talk about my sons again, specifically David and Mark, the two I suspected most. David, the investment banker, was the first target. His office tower was literally across the street. I knew his schedule. Tuesday was his late meeting day, meaning he'd come out around 6 p.m., usually with a sleek leather briefcase and his nose buried in a tablet dictating memos. I had planned this test for a Tuesday evening, right as the rush hour was peaking. I needed the chaos, the speed, the lack of time for reflection. I saw him precisely at 6:05 p.m. He wasn't alone. He was with two colleagues, both men in suits that probably cost more than Ben's rent for 3 months. They were laughing, their voices sharp and clear in the evening air. David was holding court, gesturing broadly with one hand, his gold watch catching the streetlights. He was talking about a massive deal that had just closed, and I could hear snippets of the conversation. Leveraging 8 figures. Acquisition. He looked exactly like the portrait of success he'd painted for himself. He looked successful, untouchable, and utterly self-absorbed. My heart actually started to physically ache in my chest. This wasn't just a test of them, it was a test of me. Could I watch my own flesh and blood dismiss me like this? They walked directly toward me. I hunched over more, making myself look smaller, more pitiable. I held out my cardboard sign, ensuring they would have to step slightly to the side to avoid brushing my dirty boot. They were maybe 5 feet away, 3 feet too. David walked right past. He didn't slow down. He didn't flinch. He didn't even glance in my direction. His eyes were focused straight ahead on the expensive black car pulling up to the curb. He was so engrossed in his triumphant narrative that he didn't register the human obstacle, the woman kneeling right in his path. He just navigated around me as if I were a piece of trash, a discarded wrapper, something utterly irrelevant to his life. His colleague, a young woman with a sharp bob, did spare me a fractional fleeting glance, a mixture of pity and immediate revulsion, before she quickly followed David's lead and looked away. It was a punch to the gut. A shocking, dizzying realization that hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't the distracted indifference of a stranger. This was the deliberate blindness of a son who had grown to see only value in wealth and power. I watched him effortlessly slide into the backseat of the waiting car, still talking, still laughing, completely oblivious that he had just stepped over his own mother. The car pulled away, leaving me sitting there, the chill of the evening settling deep into my bones, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. I felt betrayed not by money, but by the absence of soul in my own son. I swallowed the lump in my throat, fought back the heat of tears that threatened to wash away my careful disguise, and tried to stabilize my breathing. David was out. With every fiber of my being, I knew he could never inherit Richard's legacy. Not a penny of it. I spent the next hour just recovering, letting the shock subside. I had to remind myself that this wasn't the end, that Mark still had a chance. Mark was more impulsive, less calculated than David. Maybe his failure would be less cold, less absolute. Maybe he would hesitate. Mark was scheduled to have drinks at a trendy rooftop bar 2 blocks away. I knew he often took a shortcut through a small, pedestrian-only plaza on his way to the parking garage. The plaza was quieter than the main street, a little garden oasis with a few benches. I moved my operation there. It was a more intimate setting, which would make the encounter even more telling. The silence there was broken only by the distant city noise and the occasional high-pitched laugh from the bar above. I sat on a low wall, my sign propped beside me, looking genuinely weary. Around 7:30 p.m. I saw him. Mark was unmistakable. He was wearing a shockingly bright tailored jacket, electric blue I think, and blindingly white sneakers. He was walking fast, scrolling through something on his phone, a frown of concentration on his face. He looked stressed, important, and completely self-absorbed, just like his brother. He wasn't looking up. He was walking the walk of a man whose time was too valuable to waste on the environment around him. He was practically on top of me before he looked up. His eyes swept over me, the matted hair, the dirted coat, the sign, but the recognition was zero. Absolutely zero. He saw a homeless woman, a momentary inconvenience. But unlike David, Mark didn't just pass. He slowed down, fumbled in his jacket pocket and pulled out a bill. A $5 bill. He didn't look at me. His eyes were still scanning his phone, clearly marking me as a background element. He tossed the bill onto the wall beside me, the paper fluttering slightly before settling. "Here," he muttered, his tone clipped, dismissive, almost annoyed. It wasn't an act of charity. It was a transaction to clear his path and his conscience instantly. It was the cost of making the problem go away. He didn't wait for a thanks, didn't make eye contact, and certainly didn't pause for a conversation. He walked away quickly, already back to the urgent business on his screen, the blue jacket a jarring contrast to the muted, tired colors of the plaza. He had thrown a handful of change at the problem and moved on. The gesture was less cold than David's outright avoidance, but in a way it was worse. David saw nothing. Mark saw a thing to be paid off and forgotten. The transactional nature of his action made my stomach turn. He hadn't seen his mother or even another human being in need. He had seen a speed bump, easily flattened with a small bit of currency. I picked up the $5 bill. It felt insultingly light in my trembling, dirty hand. I slowly tore the bill in half, then into quarters, watching the crisp paper flutter to the ground. Mark was out too. The two sons who were financially successful had utterly, miserably failed the simple test of humanity. The despair was crushing. I had two down and only Ben, my struggling, artistic, kind-hearted Ben, left. The weight of hope and the terrifying fear of complete disappointment settled entirely on him. The failure of David and Mark didn't just hurt. It radically changed my perspective. Before the test, I had clung to the hope that their focus on money was just a phase, a side effect of their ambition. But seeing them in action, utterly devoid of recognition or even basic human empathy for a perceived lowlife, proved that the rot went deeper than I thought. They were defined by their success, and anything outside that bubble was beneath their notice. I folded my tattered cardboard sign and decided to wait for Ben. But now the stakes felt terrifyingly real. What if Ben too failed? What if all three of my boys had been permanently damaged by the sheer size of the wealth they grew up around, the promise of the fortune? The thought made me feel physically ill. I knew Ben's schedule was chaotic. He didn't work a rigid 9 to 5 like his brothers. He taught his sculpting class in the evenings at a community center a few blocks from the plaza, usually grabbing a quick, cheap dinner somewhere between his studio time and the class. I figured the best time to catch him would be around 8:30 p.m., just as he was hurrying to class or maybe stopping to get that quick meal. I decided to move my location again, seeking a place more connected to the community, less about commerce and more about everyday life. I walked slowly, dragging my feet, mimicking the profound exhaustion of someone who truly lived on the streets. The transformation in how people treated me continued. They didn't just avoid eye contact. They actively created distance, some even pulling their children closer as I shuffled past. I settled on a bench near a small local library entrance. This area was more mixed, students, blue-collar workers, and a few lingering artists. It felt right, closer to Ben's world. The night air was turning sharp, and despite the layers of clothing, the cold was biting through. I wrapped my arms around myself, hunched over, and let my head drop slightly. I didn't have to act the exhaustion anymore. The emotional toll of the day was making me genuinely weary. As I waited, a new, complex challenge arose, one I hadn't prepared for. Two different young men approached me. The first was a genuinely kind-looking student who stopped and asked if I needed directions or if I was okay. He looked genuinely concerned. The irony of being helped by a stranger while my own sons walked past was almost too much to bear. I kept my head down and just mumbled, "No thank you," just resting my eyes. He hesitated, then respectfully moved on. The second encounter was a little more aggressive. A scruffy man, clearly drunk, started shouting crude remarks at me from across the street. He was being loud and accusatory, demanding to know why I wasn't at a shelter. This added a layer of fear to my experiment. I wasn't safe. I was exposed. The anonymity of the wealth I usually enjoyed was a form of protection, and without it I was vulnerable to every threat the city had to offer. I wanted to bolt, to run back to my warm, safe house, to shower off the grime and pretend this never happened. But I couldn't. Ben was the last chance, the last line of defense against the despair that had settled in after David and Mark's performances. I had to see this through. The rising tension was excruciating. Every passing figure made my heart leap. Was that him? No, too tall. Was that him? No, wrong coat. I started to question the entire operation. Was it fair? Was it manipulative? Maybe my sons were just busy, maybe they were distracted, maybe it was bad timing. But I quickly shut those excuses down. Compassion isn't something you turn on and off based on your schedule. It's a core reflex. Even a single second of pause, a flicker of humanity, would have saved them. They offered nothing. Finally I saw him. Around 8:40 p.m. a beaten-up, rust-colored pickup truck, Ben's truck, the one I fondly called the Beast, pulled up about a block away and parked legally, which was always a miracle. Ben emerged. He was wearing his usual uniform, faded jeans, a well-loved flannel shirt, and a heavy, slightly paint-splattered canvas jacket. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder, probably containing his supplies and his dinner. He looked tired too. Not the stressed-out exhaustion of a banker chasing a deal, but the physical weariness of a man who worked hard with his hands. He was walking directly toward the library, his head slightly down, clearly focused on getting where he needed to go. He wasn't on the phone, he was just walking. As he got closer, I could see the smudge of clay on his cheek and the faint stain of oil paint on his fingers. He looked like the kind of son I hoped I had raised, grounded, real, and a little bit rough around the edges. I had made sure the route to his community center class would take him right past my bench. This was it. The moment of truth. I tried to make myself look as vulnerable as possible, leaning my head against the cold stone, holding my sign loosely. I didn't make a sound. I just waited, letting the visual speak for itself. He was 5 feet away. 3 feet. Then he stopped. He didn't just walk past or toss a coin. He stopped. His body physically halted a few feet in front of me. I felt his eyes on me. I kept my own eyes trained on the dirty pavement, my heart hammering like a drum against my ribs. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the smell of turpentine and honest labor. He hesitated for a long, agonizing moment. I held my breath. Was he going to reach into his pocket? Was he going to walk away? Then he did something utterly unexpected. He sat down. He actually sat on the bench beside me. Not with a wide gap of space, but close enough that I could feel the slight shift in the bench's balance. He lowered his backpack to the ground with a soft thud. I remained frozen, waiting for him to say something. A judgmental question, a dismissive platitude. But he didn't. He just sat there, breathing steadily. The silence was intense, broken only by the distant sounds of traffic. I risked a quick upward glance, just a peek from under my matted hat. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking straight ahead at the wall across the street. He didn't look repulsed or annoyed. He looked comfortable, or perhaps just resigned to sharing the space. It was the complete lack of panic or disgust that immediately set him apart from his brothers. He simply saw another human being occupying a bench, and he respected the space. He respected me, the person he believed to be a stranger, a homeless woman. "Rough night?" he finally asked, his voice low, gentle, and utterly devoid of judgment. His voice was warm, the way it always was when he spoke to me. The irony of hearing my son's kind voice while dressed like this brought a fresh sting of tears to my eyes. I didn't dare answer, fearing my voice would betray me. I just offered a small, non-committal shrug, leaning further into the pretense of profound weariness. He didn't push. He just settled in, opened his backpack, and that was when the real moment of truth began to unfold. Ben, sitting next to me, accepting my presence without question or complaint, was the first real comfort I'd felt all day. His simple inquiry, "Rough night?" was a world away from David's outright rejection and Mark's transactional pity. But the test wasn't over. David and Mark had failed the test of recognition and basic courtesy. Ben was about to face the deeper test, the test of sacrifice and shared scarcity. He opened his backpack not to pull out his phone or a business journal, but to pull out his dinner. It was a modest meal, clearly packed from home. A slightly squashed paper napkin holding a sandwich, probably peanut butter and jelly, his childhood favorite, or maybe a simple turkey and cheese, and a slightly bruised apple. This was his fuel for his evening class, his sustenance, and knowing Ben's financial situation, this was likely a carefully budgeted meal, not some superfluous indulgence. He unwrapped the sandwich and took a slow, thoughtful bite. I watched him from under the brim of my hat, my throat dry. I felt the powerful urge to drop the act, to hug him and tell him how much I loved him, how proud I was. But I knew I couldn't. I needed to see what happened next. He finished chewing and then turned his head slightly toward me. He didn't look at my face, maintaining that respectful distance, but focused instead on my hands, which were tucked into the dirty sleeves of my coat. "You haven't eaten, have you?" he asked, his voice still gentle. I swallowed hard, keeping my persona intact. I shook my head slowly, minimally, keeping my chin low. Ben sighed, a soft, weary sound that spoke of empathy. He didn't reach for a $20 bill or offer me directions to a soup kitchen. He reached for the rest of his sandwich. He carefully separated the two halves of the remaining sandwich, taking the bigger half for himself, which was natural. He was a young man with manual labor ahead of him, but then he hesitated for a split second. That split second was the turning point. In that moment he must have registered my obvious need and his own limited resources. He then pushed his own half away and instead took the smaller half and held it out to me. "Look, I only have this," he said, his voice quiet. "It's turkey and cheese. Not exactly five-star dining, but it's better than nothing, right? You should have it." He didn't push it into my hand or drop it onto the bench. He held it patiently, waiting for me to take it. He was offering half of his precious ration dinner to a complete stranger, a woman who looked like she hadn't seen a shower in weeks, simply because she was hungry. The act was so profoundly kind, so selfless, that the meticulously constructed walls around my heart shattered. David had walked past a fortune. Mark had tossed away a $5 offering, but Ben was giving away his actual sustenance, his energy for the next few hours of work. He was sacrificing his own comfort for mine. I slowly reached out a trembling, dirty hand, my fingers brushing against the rough paper napkin. I took the sandwich half. The bread was slightly stale, the meat and cheese simple, but it felt like the most luxurious, life-affirming gift I had ever received. "Thank you," I croaked out, trying to disguise my voice, but the emotion made the words catch in my throat. He gave me a small, genuine smile. "Don't mention it. Everyone needs a decent meal, especially when it's cold." He then opened his backpack again and took out a plastic bottle of water, which was half full. He carefully unscrewed the cap and placed the bottle on the bench right next to the sandwich. "And water," he added. "Stay hydrated." I held the small sandwich half, tears burning behind my eyes. I didn't take a bite immediately. I couldn't. I was too overwhelmed. I realized Ben wasn't treating me as a concept, a political problem, or an eyesore. He saw me as a person, a fellow member of the human race who was cold and hungry. That was all. He didn't ask what I did wrong or why I was there. He offered unconditional help. He then started chatting casually, still looking mostly ahead, giving me the dignity of not staring. He spoke about his class, about the frustrating texture of the new clay he was trying, and about how excited he was for his upcoming small exhibition at a local gallery. He was sharing his life with me, a stranger on a bench. "It's tough, you know," he murmured, leaning forward. "Trying to make it as an artist. You're always one broken piece or one missed sale away from disaster. But I love it. I wouldn't trade it for a fancy corner office. My brothers think I'm crazy," he chuckled lightly, a sound that was full of honest resignation and peace. "They're always telling me to get a real job, to leverage my degree. But what's the point of having everything if you're miserable? I'd rather be poor and happy than rich and, well, them." He looked at me then, truly looking, and saw the profound sadness in my eyes. "But hey, you didn't need to hear all that," he quickly corrected himself. "Sorry. Everyone has their own struggles." I finally managed to take a small bite of the sandwich. Tasted wonderful, not because of the ingredients but because of the intention behind it. It was the taste of pure, uncomplicated human kindness. After a few more minutes, he checked his old analog watch. "Oh man, I gotta run or I'll be late for the demonstration. That clay needs to be wedged just right." He stood up and pulled his backpack onto his shoulder. "Be safe tonight," he said, looking down at me. "And if you're still here when my class finishes, I'll try to swing by and bring you my apple. It's a good one." He didn't wait for a reply, just gave a quick, reassuring nod and hurried off toward the community center, his mission clear: to teach, to create, and to keep his promise about the apple. He wasn't thinking about a fortune. He wasn't thinking about investment strategies or acquisitions. He was thinking about a piece of bread and a promise to a hungry stranger. I watched him go, the half-eaten sandwich in my hand suddenly feeling like the heaviest, most valuable thing in the world. He had passed the test. He had passed the test with flying colors, not by doing something grand or dramatic, but by doing something small and truly compassionate when he had very little to give. I sat there for another minute, letting the full weight of the day settle. The despair from David and Mark's rejection was completely overshadowed by the overwhelming pride and relief that flooded my senses. My youngest son, the struggling artist, the black sheep of the financial family, was the only one who had inherited his father's true wealth: a generous, good heart. I carefully wrapped the rest of the sandwich in the napkin, placing it in my hidden pocket along with the water bottle, and stood up, leaving the dirty coat, the hat, and the sign right there on the bench. The test was over. It was time for the transformation, not just of my appearance, but of my entire life's legacy. I didn't wait for Ben to finish his class. The moment he disappeared inside the community center, I walked quickly down the street, feeling lighter than I had all day despite the grimy clothes. I found a dimly lit alley, pulled out the key to my back door, and hailed a waiting taxi that I had arranged earlier in the day. A contingency plan just in case things went south. I sat in the back seat of the luxury sedan, peeling off the layers of filth and costume, wiping away the smudged makeup with pre-moistened wipes. The transformation was quick, shocking, and profoundly emotional. As the layers of dirt came off, the layers of sadness lifted. By the time I arrived back at the mansion, I was still wearing the underlying clothes from the disguise, but my face was clean and my posture was restored. I felt like Jenny again, but a Jenny who was finally completely clear-sighted. I went straight to the library, to the mahogany desk where Richard and I used to work on charity galas, and pulled out my husband's old leather-bound notepad. I didn't call my lawyer that night. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I needed to write it down while the emotions were fresh, while the memory of that half sandwich was still warm in my hand. The next morning I called my longtime estate lawyer, Mr. Thompson. He was the kind of man who dealt exclusively in old money and hushed tones. I told him I needed to see him immediately, and I needed a complete, irrevocable redrafting of the will. He protested, of course. Mrs. Evelyn. I mean Mrs. Jenny, he corrected himself. This is highly unusual. The current distribution is perfectly equitable. Are you absolutely certain about this drastic change? I looked him straight in the eye. Mr. Thompson, I am absolutely certain. The current distribution is mathematically equitable but morally corrupt. The will must reflect true wealth, not just bank account balances. I laid out the details. The entire fortune, the main estate, the considerable stock portfolio, the trusts, the holiday homes, everything Richard and I had built, was to be immediately transferred to Ben, my youngest son. David and Mark were to receive one modest, non-liquidating annuity each. Enough to pay their taxes for a year and maybe finance a small vacation, but nothing that would fundamentally change their already extravagant lives. The amount was a fraction of the total estate, a token gesture, a clear statement. Mr. Thompson, to his credit, managed to keep his shock mostly internal. And the reason for this, Mrs. Jenny? They are both successful businessmen. They are successful, yes, I replied, my voice firm. But they have failed the test of character. They proved they value the pursuit of material wealth far above basic human empathy. They walked right past their mother when they thought she was nothing. That kind of moral blindness cannot be rewarded with a legacy that was built on hard work and decent values. Ben, who has the least, was the only one who offered everything he had. The papers were drafted, signed, and notarized within the week, ironclad and undeniable. The estate was now legally Ben's, effective immediately upon the moment I chose to tell them. The great reveal took place 2 weeks later. I invited all 3 sons to a formal dinner at the mansion. David showed up late, still on a call, talking about a hostile takeover. Mark arrived with a flashy, much younger companion, complaining loudly about the traffic and the inefficiency of the city's infrastructure. Ben was the first to arrive, carrying a simple wrapped gift, a small hand-sculpted clay bird he had just finished. The dinner was tense, filled with David and Mark's competitive banter, each trying to subtly inquire about my portfolio management and the upcoming annual trust review. Ben mostly listened, occasionally offering a genuine question about my health. After the dessert was cleared, I stood up and asked them to join me in the library. This was the moment. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. David and Mark looked expectant, their eyes bright with avarice, probably assuming I was announcing a large pre-inheritance dividend. I didn't waste any time. I held up the 2 documents, the old equitable will and the new, drastically different one. Boys, I began, my voice steady, for the past 3 years since your father's passing, you have treated me not as your mother, but as the gatekeeper to your inheritance. This estate represents far more than money. It represents character, hard work, and the values your father and I shared. And I needed to know which of you truly understood those values. I paused, letting the silence draw out. Ben looked confused. David and Mark looked impatient. 2 weeks ago I conducted a test. A character assessment. I dressed up as a homeless woman and sat on a bench downtown, right in the path of your daily routines. I wanted to see who would stop, who would care, and who would acknowledge the inherent human worth regardless of status. The color drained from David and Mark's faces simultaneously. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They remembered. They remembered the dirty woman, the interruption, the inconvenience. I looked straight at David. David, you walked right past your mother without slowing your triumphant stride. You treated me like a piece of refuse. You saw nothing. I turned to Mark. Mark, you threw a $5 bill at me, treating me like a problem easily bought off and dismissed. You saw a nuisance. They stammered, they tried to deny it, their voices rising in panic. Mom, I didn't know. It was dark. The disguise was too good. Silence, I said, my voice cutting through their protests. You didn't see me because you weren't looking. You only see what benefits you. I turned to Ben, who was staring at me, his eyes wide, connecting the dots. Ben, I said, a smile finally breaking through the sternness. You sat down next to me. You asked if I was having a rough night. And when I told you I hadn't eaten, you gave me half of your own meager dinner and half of your water. You made a sacrifice, Ben, when you had the least to give. I placed the new redrafted will on the table, pushing it toward them. This is the legal final testament. David and Mark, you will each receive a token annuity. Ben, I looked at my youngest son, tears finally escaping my eyes. You will inherit everything. The entire estate without contingencies or conditions. You inherited your father's heart, and that is the only currency that matters to me. David and Mark erupted. The accusations flew: manipulation, unfairness, psychological torment. They screamed that Ben would squander it, that he was an artist, not a businessman. They threatened legal action. I simply let them rage unmoved. They were proving my point one last time. Their focus was entirely on the loss of the money, not the loss of my respect. Ben, meanwhile, was silent, pale, and trembling. He looked at the paperwork, then at me, completely overwhelmed. Mom, he whispered, I just wanted you to have a sandwich. I smiled. I know, sweetheart. And that sandwich bought you the world. What you choose to do with this fortune is up to you. But I know you will use it well, with the kindness and grace that you showed to a starving stranger.